Here's something that should be impossible. A movie made over 60 years ago with no computers, no digital crowds, no visual effects houses of any kind still looks more expensive than most blockbusters released this year. Every frame drips with money. Real gold, real marble, real armies of thousands. Because every frame was money. Staggering, studio destroying, almost criminal amounts of it. This is Cleopatra, the 1963 epic directed by Joseph L. Mankiewicz, starring Elizabeth Taylor, Richard Burton, and Rex Harrison, released by 20th Century Fox. It became the most expensive film ever made up to that point, and the cost nearly wiped the studio off the map. But that money didn't vanish. It's all still right there on the screen. And as you'll see, some of it is still standing in the real world today. Today, we're counting down 15 reasons Cleopatra still looks like $1 billion. And stick around for number 1, because the most jaw-dropping place this film's fortune ended up isn't on screen at all. It's a neighborhood you can walk through right now. Hit that like button, subscribe, and drop a comment. Does any modern blockbuster still look this expensive? Make your case below. Alright, roll out the gold, let's get into it. The reason Cleopatra feels physically enormous is that it was production designer John DeQueer built more than 70 full-scale sets for the film, and the centerpiece was a recreation of the Roman Forum constructed at Cinecittà Studios outside Rome, a forum that was, by multiple accounts, roughly 3 times the size of the actual ancient forum it was based on. Let that sink in. To make a movie about Rome, they built a fake Rome that was bigger than the real one, and the scale wasn't limited to one set. The construction effort was so vast, entire cities, palaces, temples, a 35-foot sphinx that it reportedly caused a genuine shortage of building materials across Italy. A single film set construction drained the supply of an entire country. Read that again. One movie built so much fake antiquity that real builders in real Italian towns couldn't get materials. This is the foundation of why the movie looks the way it does. There is no trickery in those wide shots, no matte painting standing in for grandeur. The grandeur was real, built at full size, photographed, for real. When the camera pulls back to show you the impossible scale of Cleopatra's world, it isn't showing you an illusion. It's showing you a country that ran out of plaster. Cleopatra used a reported 26,000 costumes across its entire production. Not 26,000 costume pieces, 26,000 costumes. Elizabeth Taylor alone wore 65 different outfits, and her costume budget was around $194,800. The highest ever allocated to a single screen actress at the time. But the headline detail is the gold. For Cleopatra's entrance into Rome, Taylor wears a dress made from cloth of gold, woven with actual 24-karat gold thread, a single garment that cost roughly $6,500 in 1963 money. That gleam you see on screen isn't lighting or color grading. It's real precious metal catching real light. The costume team, Irene Sharaff, Vittorio Nino Novarese, and Renee Conley, who shared the Academy Award for it, prioritized sheer visual impact over any pretense of historical accuracy, dressing Taylor in what was essentially 1960s high glamour by way of ancient Egypt. There's a small, telling detail underneath all this opulence. While Taylor dripped in gold, Richard Burton's boots as Mark Antony were hand-me-downs, reused from Stephen Boyd, who had been cast in an earlier, abandoned version of the film. The Queen wore a fortune. Antony wore another actor's old shoes. Those 65 costume changes weren't just expensive, they were, officially, a world record. Elizabeth Taylor earned a Guinness World Record for the most costume changes in a single film, a benchmark that stood for years before Julie Andrews finally eclipsed it in 1968 with 125 changes in the film Star. For half a decade, Cleopatra held the title for the most clothes ever put on one character in movie history. What makes this more than a trivia book footnote is what it tells you about the film's entire philosophy. Most productions reuse costumes, redress the same few outfits, keep the wardrobe department lean because clothing is expensive and audiences rarely notice. Cleopatra did the opposite. It treated Taylor as a living centerpiece to be re-gilded scene after scene, never repeating, always escalating, each entrance more lavish than the last. The wardrobe wasn't supporting the spectacle, the wardrobe was the spectacle. When a film decides its lead actress should never be seen in the same thing twice across 4 hours of screen time, you are looking at a production with no financial breaks whatsoever, and that recklessness is precisely why it still dazzles. Consider just one object in this film, Cleopatra's golden barge, the floating palace she arrives on at Tarsus. That one set piece reportedly cost around $277,000, which, adjusted for inflation, lands near $2 million in today's money. $2 million for a boat that appears in a handful of shots. in a film stuffed with 70 other sets, 26,000 costumes, and a sphinx the size of a building. This is the detail that recalibrates how you watch the movie. When most films build a hero prop, it's the single most expensive thing in the production, the splurge they budget around. In Cleopatra, a $2 million barge is just one line item among hundreds, not even close to the costliest thing on screen. The film operated at a scale where a sum that would be the entire budget of a normal movie was spent on a single vessel that floats through a few minutes of footage. To put it in perspective, in the same year Cleopatra was draining Fox's account, the 8th highest grossing film of 1963, To Kill a Mockingbird, was made for around $2 million, its entire production. Cleopatra's barge cost roughly what an entire acclaimed, Oscar-winning movie cost to make. Every time you notice something gorgeous in this film, your instinct is to assume the studio cut corners somewhere to afford it. They didn't. They just spent more on everything, all the time. The barge isn't an exception to how this film was made. It's the rule: floating. Cleopatra's entrance into Rome is the film's most famous sequence, and at its climax, she rides through the Arch of Constantine, seated atop a 35-foot black sphinx. An enormous, monolithic prop that had to be physically hauled across the set by a small army of performers. Reportedly around 300 extras pulling it forward by hand. There were no motors doing the work in the shot, no hidden machinery. To move the Sphinx, you needed hundreds of human beings straining in unison, and that sequence was a logistical nightmare in ways the finished footage hides beautifully. The procession and the Sphinx's entrance were filmed months apart, creating lighting match problems. The child actor playing Cleopatra's young son grew noticeably taller during the delay and had to be swapped for an Italian boy whose thick accent is audible in the final cut. The thousands of extras created their own chaos. At one point, the female performers playing Cleopatra's slave girls went on strike, demanding protection from the male extras, an incident the gossip press gleefully dubbed the Revolt of the Slave Girls. The smaller disasters are almost funnier. A flock of doves meant to burst dramatically from a miniature pyramid grew so sluggish in the Roman heat that they simply refused to fly, forcing a crew member to hide inside the prop and shoo them out by hand at the right moment. Another elaborate master shot was reportedly spoiled when the camera caught an enterprising extra quietly selling gelato to his fellow performers mid-take. This is what real spectacle costs. Not just money, but hundreds of people, striking, sweating, hawking ice cream, and dragging a stone monster through a fake Rome. The crowd in Cleopatra's Roman entrance was made up of thousands of real Italian extras, and during filming, that crowd nearly turned into a genuine emergency. Tensions were already high. Taylor's affair with Burton had drawn public condemnation, even from the Vatican, and there had been threats against her life. Armed soldiers lined the route with barriers and cables specifically to guard against an assassination attempt as Taylor, in full costume, rode through on the Sphinx. Then the crowd surged. They broke through the barriers and the cables and came pouring toward her. For a terrifying moment, the crew believed the worst was happening. But as the crowd closed in, Taylor realized they weren't shouting threats. They were shouting, "Bacio, Liz! Kiss us, Liz!" declaring their adoration for her. The fear drained out of the moment, and Taylor, overwhelmed, dropped out of character entirely and began to cry, blowing kisses back to the crowd that had just terrified everyone around her. The scene was ruined and had to be reshot. The most expensive procession ever filmed was nearly derailed because the extras loved the star too much to stay in line. Here's the part that makes the film's polished surface genuinely astonishing. There was, for much of the shoot, no finished screenplay. When Joseph Mankiewicz took over the production, he threw out the existing script and began writing his own from scratch, while filming was already underway. His solution to this impossible situation was brutal. He directed the film during the day and wrote the next pages at night, sustaining himself with amphetamine injections to keep going, even wearing protective gloves because the stress had given him dermatitis on both hands. He was shooting the film in sequence because he was inventing it as he went, which meant entire casts of actors and thousands of extras sometimes sat idle on full pay, waiting for pages that didn't exist yet. Mankiewicz later described the production in a single, unforgettable phrase: conceived in emergency, shot in confusion, wound up in blind panic. A studio publicist admitted it was the only film he ever worked on where nobody knew what would be shot until they arrived on set that morning. And yet none of that chaos is visible in the gorgeous, stately final film. The desperation was real. The exhaustion was real. The amphetamines were real. The seamless epic was the illusion. For the film's final scenes, the production wanted to shoot in Egypt itself, the actual land of the actual Cleopatra. There was a problem. Egypt initially refused to allow Elizabeth Taylor into the country at all because she had converted to Judaism upon her marriage to Eddie Fisher, and Egypt's political tensions with Israel made her persona non grata. The star of the most lavish depiction of an Egyptian queen ever filmed was, for a time, forbidden from setting foot in Egypt. Then the math intervened. Egyptian officials reconsidered when they realized what the production would mean economically. That a Hollywood film of this magnitude shooting on location would pour an enormous amount of American money directly into the Egyptian economy. The ban evaporated. The principle that had kept Taylor out was quietly outweighed by the dollars she would bring in. It's a perfect miniature of the entire Cleopatra phenomenon, a film so expensive that its budget could bend a nation's foreign policy. The money didn't just buy sets and costumes, it bought a reversal of a government's own border decision. That is a scale of spending most films can't even conceptualize. A normal production worries about permits and weather. Cleopatra was large enough that an entire country recalculated its principles around the revenue it would bring and decided the dollars mattered more than the ban. When a movie's mere arrival is treated as an economic event by a sovereign state, you are no longer talking about a film budget. You are talking about a force of nature with a release date. If you're realizing this movie was basically a small nation's GDP poured onto a film set, hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment. Would you rather watch one practical epic like this or 10 modern CGI blockbusters? Make your case below. Now, back to the gold. The naval warfare in Cleopatra, the fleets, the war galleys, the Battle of Actium required an enormous number of real ships and boats to be built and assembled. The scale got so absurd that it produced one of the most repeated claims in Hollywood lore, that during production, 20th Century Fox had effectively assembled the third largest navy in the world. A movie studio in the business of making films had amassed a fleet that allegedly outnumbered the actual navies of most sovereign nations on Earth. Whether that claim is literally precise or production legend hyperbole, the underlying reality isn't in dispute. The film built real vessels at a scale that genuinely invited comparison to national military forces. The Battle of Actium, the naval clash that decides the fate of Antony and Cleopatra, wasn't going to be faked with a few boats bobbing in a studio tank. It needed a believable fleet, and a believable ancient fleet in 1962 meant actually constructing one. This is what separates Cleopatra from the epics that came after it. When you watch the naval sequences, you're not watching models in a tank or pixels in a render. You're watching a fleet that was real enough that people seriously discussed it in the same breath as the world's actual navies. The film didn't depict an empire's resources, it briefly commanded them. A studio went to war with itself, financially, and built an armada to do it, and then, when the production finally ended, that navy simply evaporated. Its purpose served, a fortune in ships built for a handful of minutes of screen time. The reason Taylor's Cleopatra looks so iconic, the heavy black eyeliner sweeping into points, the gold lids, the impossibly dramatic eyes, is that the makeup was engineered for maximum visual luxury, and it worked so well it escaped the film entirely and reshaped fashion. The Cleopatra eye became a genuine global trend. Revlon ran a campaign promoting Sphinx eyes makeup. The film popularized snake rings, arm cuffs, geometric haircuts, and bold maxi dresses, rippling outward into the broader 1960s look that would define the decade. This matters to the question of why the film still looks like $1 billion, because it reveals that the production wasn't just spending money, it was manufacturing desire. Every design choice was calibrated to make the audience covet what they were seeing, to make Cleopatra's wealth and beauty feel like something you could reach toward at a department store cosmetics counter. The look was so persuasive, so expensive seeming, that millions of real women spent real money trying to capture a piece of it, and the influence didn't fade with the film. The Cleopatra silhouette, the liner, the metallics, the bold geometric styling fed directly into the visual language of the entire 1960s, a decade that would push color and graphic boldness further every year. A 4-hour epic that audiences and critics often mocked for its excess, nonetheless dictated how a generation of women painted their eyes. A film about the most glamorous woman in the ancient world became an engine that sold glamour itself. The spectacle didn't stay on screen. It walked out of the theater and onto people's faces, and it stayed there for years. The version of Cleopatra the world saw was a fraction of what Mankiewicz actually made. His initial cut of the film ran somewhere around 6 hours, and his genuine intention was to release the story as 2 separate full-length films. Caesar and Cleopatra followed by Antony and Cleopatra, each running about 3 hours. The studio refused, desperate to start recouping its catastrophic investment and to capitalize on the Taylor-Burton scandal immediately. Fox forced the 6 hours down to roughly 4 for the premiere, then hacked it again to just over 3 so theaters could fit in more daily showings. Elizabeth Taylor attended an early screening of the reduced version and was reportedly devastated by what had been done to it, feeling the cuts had removed the heart, the motivation, the very core of the story. Leaving the spectacle without the soul, she found the result vulgar. Whole subplots and character arcs vanished. The tragedy here is bound up with the budget. The film looks like $1 billion, partly because there was originally far more of it, an entire second movie's worth of craft and performance sacrificed on the cutting room floor to make the schedule work. You are watching the expensive skeleton of something that was once even bigger. Before any of the spectacle you see was even filmed, Cleopatra had already devoured a fortune in a false start most people don't know about. Production originally began in 1960 at Pinewood Studios in England, under a different director, Rouben Mamoulian, with elaborate Egyptian sets already constructed. Then everything collapsed. The cold, damp English weather wrecked the sets and the imported tropical plants, and Elizabeth Taylor became so gravely ill with pneumonia that she required an emergency tracheotomy, a procedure that left a scar visible in some shots of the finished film. One news agency even mistakenly reported that she had died. After roughly a year and only about 10 minutes of usable footage, the entire English production was abandoned. The Pinewood sets were dismantled at a cost of around $600,000. The director was replaced by Mankiewicz, and the whole enterprise relocated to Rome to start over nearly from zero. Millions have been spent to produce almost nothing. There's a strange afterlife to this too. Those abandoned English sets didn't entirely go to waste. They were later repurposed for the 1964 British comedy Carry On Cleo, which built an entire spoof on the bones of the disaster. Cleopatra was so expensive it accidentally funded another studio's movie. Elizabeth Taylor changed the economics of stardom with this film. When she signed on, she negotiated a then unheard of salary of $1 million, making her the first actor in history to command a 7-figure fee for a single picture. It was a watershed moment in Hollywood's financial history, the beginning of the modern era of the megastar payday. But the $1 million figure was only the start of the story, because the production dragged on for years through the abandoned English shoot, Taylor's illness, the endless Rome delays, her contract's overage and percentage provisions kept compounding. By the time the dust settled, her total take from Cleopatra reportedly reached around $7 million. An almost incomprehensible sum for a single film role in the early 1960s. She didn't just become the first $1 million actor, she became, through the film's own chaos, one of the highest paid performers the industry had ever produced. The film's inability to control its costs flowed directly into its star's bank account. Every delay that bled the studio enriched Taylor. The most expensive movie ever made was, in part, expensive because of the woman at its center, and she was paid accordingly. Here is the technical answer to why Cleopatra still looks crisp and immense on a modern high-definition screen, when so many films of its era look soft and dated. It was shot in Todd AO, a large format process using 65mm film negative, roughly 4 times the surface area of standard 35mm stock. More negative area means more captured detail, more resolution, more information baked permanently into every frame. The film was, in a literal physical sense, recording far more visual data than an ordinary movie of its time. This is why the spectacle holds up. When a film is restored and remastered for 4K today, a 65mm original has the raw detail to fill a modern screen with breathtaking clarity, because the information was always there in the negative, waiting. The vast sets, the gold thread, the thousands of extras, all of it was captured at a resolution that, decades later, still rewards the sharpest screens we can build. Most films from 1963 were shot on 35mm and look exactly their age. Their negatives simply don't hold enough detail to survive a modern remaster. Cleopatra was built to outlast its own era without anyone quite intending it to. Cinematographer Leon Shamroy won an Academy Award for it. The film didn't just spend enormous money on what was in front of the camera, it used the finest, largest, most detailed possible format to record it, which is why the $1 billion is still visible, pin sharp, 60 years on. The money bought the spectacle. The film stock made sure the spectacle never faded. This is where all the money finally leads, and it's the most jaw-dropping place to find it. Cleopatra's spiraling costs helped push 20th Century Fox to the very edge of bankruptcy. And to survive, the studio sold off a huge piece of its backlot, somewhere around 260 to 300 acres of prime Los Angeles land. That land was developed into Century City, the dense cluster of high-rise office towers, hotels, and shopping centers that still stand in West Los Angeles today. The skyscrapers you can walk among right now rose from the ground the studio was forced to sell to stay alive. Now, the honest version is a little more tangled than the legend. Fox had actually begun selling that land back in 1958 before Cleopatra's overruns fully hit, as television was already eating into movie revenue. But the film's near-fatal cost is forever bound up with the sale, and the popular telling isn't entirely wrong. The studio's desperation and Century City's birth belong to the same story. So here's the staggering takeaway. You asked why Cleopatra still looks like $1 billion. The answer is that it genuinely cost one, and you don't even need to watch the film to see where the money went. You can drive to it, you can stand inside it. An entire neighborhood of Los Angeles is the crater this movie left in the earth. The spectacle on screen is real, and so is the one you can visit. So there you have it. 15 reasons Cleopatra still looks like $1 billion. A fake Rome, bigger than the real one. Dresses woven from actual gold, a $2 million barge, a script written on amphetamines, a studio with its own navy, all of it shot on 65mm film so it still gleams in 4K today. It nearly destroyed a studio, rewrote what a movie star could be paid, and left its last fortune standing as a Los Angeles skyline you can walk through. They don't make them like this anymore because they can't afford to. Like, subscribe, and share this with whoever still insists old movies can't look expensive. Until next time, spend it like Cleopatra.